Welcome, members and guests. For those new to the Chamber, my name is Rowan Peps, the Executive Director here at the Australian Chamber of Commerce in South Korea. My absolute pleasure to welcome you to our latest webinar, the Australian Tax and May Budget Update, with our Senior Financial Specialists, Nathan Andrews and Geoff Taylor. This webinar is a bit of an update from what we did last year, where we touched on some of the reforms to Australian tax laws. And this one was sort of a follow-up on that and aims to dissect the proposed tax reforms that are coming out of the May federal budget, which are likely to take form from the 1st of July this year. Additionally, it will touch on some of the changes outlined in the federal budget and how that can affect some of our members, especially those who are working abroad. If you do have any questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A box below, and if we've got time, we'll be sure to touch on those. But without further ado, I'd like to now hand it off to our financial specialist, Geoff and Nathan. Welcome aboard. Thank you very much for joining me today. And yeah, Nathan, can you take it from here?
Okay, thank you, Rowan. Thanks very much. Okay, so hi, everybody, from a lovely sunny afternoon in Seoul. Okay, so just a brief introduction, really. Obviously, as Rowan said, Geoff and I are very much on financial planning, tax for Australian expats, wherever they may be globally. Crucially, we've had the budget on Tuesday night in Australia, so there have been some changes there that Geoff's going to sort of come on and talk about. Obviously, with Skybound Wealth, we are general financial planners. I myself, based out of a Geneva office, living in the UK, but essentially have clients all over the world. So in conjunction with the Aussie Chamber today, I'd like to say, backed by popular demand, we'll have to check with Rowan on that one. But so very much this presentation is relevant for Australians, wherever they may be globally. Okay. So I myself have been advising expats since 2008 globally, predominantly British, Australians, European expats. Typically, we work in areas such as general financial planning, being sort of capital growth, offshore taxation. Obviously, global expats tend to have various benefits working globally, maybe increased income over they would back home. But it's crucial to get things right in terms of security of their money, what to do with the capital, how to invest it safely and securely. So that's very much what Skybound and myself do. And if I may, I'll just hand you over to Geoff very quickly to just say hi and introduce himself.
Yeah, so welcome all. I'm in sunny Sydney today, and I've actually done, I think, 75 seminars in 15 countries over the last 20 years. So it's very nice to be sitting in my own office instead of having to get on a plane, but I've certainly done that a lot in the past. So my specialty is tax, international tax, Australian tax, and I'm also a qualified Australian financial planner. So my financial planning advice is limited to Australia, not to overseas, but that's where Nathan's expertise is in the offshore international element. So I've been doing budget seminars, I think, for about 16 years. And it's interesting to sort of look at the changes over those years. I guess this year it's a bit of a soft budget, but we'll run through all the different elements, and we'll also cover off some of the tax changes, including a new tax ruling that came through last year, so that you're up to date on where the tax position is regarding tax residence.
Okay, great. Thanks, Geoff. Just to explain the relationship between Magenda, Geoff, myself and Skybound. So as a company, Skybound, we arguably have access to possibly, I think the number's about 300 partnerships worldwide. So typically this includes tax experts regionally, of course, in places like Australia with Geoff Taylor, investment houses, legal representatives, you utilize private banking, insurance solutions, pensions. So really a holistic, rounded area of sort of financial advice. Okay, as I say, I myself based out of Geneva. How all this came about, probably guessed I'm from the UK, certainly by my voice at least. So we've been doing a lot of work through the Australian chambers, both in the UK and Switzerland, and it's a pleasure to be.
We maybe just lost Nathan. So if we do, we might skip ahead, Geoff.
Yeah, so I think we'll just keep on going. So as Nathan was saying, Skybound Wealth is in multi-jurisdictional organisation. I've done seminars with them in Geneva and other locations around the world. So they're very experienced, and we look after each other, cross-refer, and try to assist people wherever we can. So they're the type of investments that they offer, typical type of offshore fare, life insurance products, investment products, pension products, and also superannuation trusts. And multi-award winning, no question about that. Very, very good organisation. So in terms of what I'm presenting today, I'll just start off briefly talking about Magenda, who we are, and basically cover off the budget. So it's a big budget and there's a lot of things to cover, but I'll just basically hit the high points along the way and give a bit of an economic update. I'll also cover off some of the tax changes that are already in the pipeline, some being hardly thought about at the moment on superannuation. The stage 3 tax cuts are already legislated and coming into play from 1 July. And also long overdue tax ruling on tax residents that came out last year, so I'll run through that. And the actual big changes are still on hold. So it's been over 3 years since they were announced, but still on hold. So just a general advice warning, anything you hear in this presentation is just general in nature. I haven't looked at your goals and objectives or anything like that, and neither has Nathan. So it's just general in nature. So I guess the best place to start for this presentation, and when I heard someone say in the media that this was Jim Chalmers' third budget, I just wondered to myself, how do we actually get to 3? And they've only been in government for a couple of years. And so I went back and I just did this timeline. So you go back in time and there was an early budget in, we'll call it budget number 1 in 2022. So this is where the Morrison government decided they go to an election early. So they brought a budget down and then they went to the election early on the 21st of May and lost. And so, of course, Labor, once they came in, they wanted to do a new budget. So the new parliament was convened and basically it's worth noting that Labor only won 77 seats out of 151, so they didn't have a huge majority. New Parliament 26th of July, which led to a new budget. And then we're back to a normal cycle now, second Tuesday in May, 9th of May, and the 14th of May this year. But the key issue is that the next budget is due, the next election is due by the 27th of September. So Labor's really got to think about, do they want to go early? Do they want to do another budget then next year and then go to an election? And that will depend a lot on what happens with the economy and what happens with interest rates. So this is, in a sense, a pre-election budget. And I think if things go well, Labor will probably go early. I was talking to a client today and he said he thought that, March 2025 is possible. So this is why it's sort of a don't offend anyone type budget. So I guess the key budget initiatives, the whole budget was really framed around this issue of inflation. Inflation last year in Australia sort of hit about 9% at its peak. It's down to about 3.6% at the moment. And the government's come in to sort of rescue Australians with cost of living relief, including different types of measures. I guess the energy bill relief is probably the main one that people think about. $300 doesn't sound like a lot of money. For someone who's not earning a lot of money, $300 is a lot of money. And it's basically 10 million households. When I said to my son, who works in financial planning, it's 3.5 billion, $300, he couldn't believe that there was actually 10 million households in Australia, but there is. So it's not means tested. And so that's part of what the government's doing, trying to drive down measured inflation. So that's one actual measure that you can help to do that. The stage 3 tax cuts actually go the other way because in terms of inflation, because that's going to be money in people's pocket that they'll probably spend. And some people have said it's the equivalent of 3 rate cuts next year, but it certainly does put money in the punters' pockets. So that's one of the key initiatives. So then if you go through the list of other initiatives, that's sort of a typical Labor budget, giving cheaper medications, people that don't have a lot, that need accommodation. The whole sort of care economy has been underpaid and under-resourced. So there's practical payments for nurses and midwives to get more people into that sector. I guess the student debt indexation is a key issue because the way HECS, which is if you do an undergraduate degree and spend $26,000 on student debt, the way that gets indexed is previously based on the CPI. Well, the CPI jumped out of its socks last year, and that gave students with student debt a nasty surprise. The government said the scheme's not supposed to work that way. So they've basically said retrospectively, we're going to go back and change that to no more than 2 different measures, which will basically bring it back to about 3.2% for last year and knock off some of the student debt that some people have, probably on average about, I think, $1,250. So that's a big initiative. They don't want to scare people off doing tertiary education, so that was important. I guess this future made in Australia, it's maybe a headline-getting policy. I've been through the whole sort of fluffy high-level document, and $22.7 billion spent over 10 years on various sort of pet industries isn't a lot of money. Some would argue this is subsidies and, isn't necessarily what Australia should be doing, but it sounds good to have a Made in Australia Act, and that's what's happening. So it's in certain sectors, including green energy, hydrogen, various rare minerals, and so on. So they are capping international student arrivals, so universities won't be too happy about that. They need to build more student accommodation. One example out near Macquarie University, where I live, they're building student accommodation, 735 students. So there's a lot of that happening. There's going to be a lot more spent on aged care and childcare. But overall, sort of the negative newspapers are saying that the government's killing us with kindness. But as I said, trying not to offend, anyone in the lead up to what will probably be an early election next year. The Australians said, bung it on the afterpay. And what they're meaning there is that you've got a surplus this year, but there's deficits through the 4-year forward estimates. They're saying, well, they're going to splash all this money now and run a surplus, but then we're going to be paying for it in future years. So if we get down to, I guess, the thing that holds the budget together is its estimates and assumptions. But inflation at 2.75% by Treasury, that's their forecast, is probably optimistic. A lot of things could go wrong. And if you took a poll, I think there was a poll taken of economists back in January where on average they said that the first rate cut would happen in September. That's pretty much out the window. There's actually some economists saying there could be 3 rate increases because they see inflation increasing rather than falling. So the question is whether this budget actually makes an impact. That the reason that 2.75 is so critical is because the Reserve Bank's target range is 2 to 3%. And they're pretty much not going to put through rate cuts until inflation is well and truly under that 3% level. So the government is hoping for that to happen, and they sort of want to sort of bask in the glow of lower interest rates. So they even though they don't control what the RBA does, and Jim Chalmers is always making that point that he does what he can do and the RBA does what it's responsible for. But it really is, if that is achieved, if we do see inflation track below 3%, I think you'll definitely see an early election. So you look at net migration, 528,000 looks like a massive number, but really during COVID, there's virtually no migration into Australia. So it's sort of a catch up. We need, I think, about 110,000 immigration just to hold our population steady. So it was around 160, but it looks like it's now headed for the sort of the 250,000 range out into the future. So that helps to underpin our growth. So without all of that net immigration, and it also needs to be targeted in areas where, where we're lacking skills. I'm building a project home at the moment. It looks like it's going to take 100 weeks when it should only take about 29. And this is just a massive lack of resources. It's partly because we started during the COVID period, but just a ridiculous amount of time to build anything. And the government's proposing to build 1.2 million homes. So goodness knows how they're going to be able to do that. They clearly need to selectively bring in migrants that have got skills in those key areas. Unemployment, actually today, the figure ticked up. So the government will be pleased about that in the sense of they won't be happy that more people are out of work, but it's a key metric to show that the economy is slowing down. We need to see it at 4.5% before we've got a shouting chance of being able to get inflation under control. So it's on a knife edge. Things could go either way. Jim Chalmers has said that the external international environment is fraught and fragile. He's probably right, although it doesn't look that way in the US. But if it is fraught and fragile, then we might see a bit of softness in the Australian economy, and he might get his inflation wish. So not necessarily that easy a graph to look at, but what it basically says is there's certain things that are going up a lot more than others. So you look at insurance, health, electricity, and petrol going up at more than the CPI, and things like fruit and veg and women's clothing are not. And so it's really in the services sector that's been a key area that's been going up. And you go and buy a cup of coffee and you see that, the barista is trying to get his prices up because he probably lost ground during COVID and he's trying to recover that. So you see that in restaurants and lots of different service industries, and that just keeps underpins inflation where it is. The last mile, really that last 0.6% to get under the 3% target, and people will start to feel a lot better. So it could go either way. I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't bet my house on inflation being under that 3% target by Christmas, but that's certainly what Jim Chalmers wants to happen. So when we look at these numbers, it just gives you Shane Oliver of AMP calls it his table of truth. So, the forecast last year was actually a deficit of 13.9 billion. We're now looking at 9.3 billion surplus, but then 4 years of deficits, which just shows that we're going to stay in, a structural imbalance, albeit small. But really, the amount of expenditure is still, on the high side all the way back to 1986. So 26.2% of GDP, which is still very high. They'd like it to be 25 or actually even below that, but they're not prepared to take the hit. So as soon as you bring expenditure back to 25% of GDP, you're going to have to cut programs, and you're not going to be able to hand out all those goodies that you saw in the overview. That basically that's a problem to try and cut that 1% of GDP, and so they're reluctant to do it now. Maybe they'll do it in future years, but certainly not in the foreseeable future. So it ends up bracket creep. So when we see tax cuts starting from 1 July, we think, oh, fantastic. But it's really just the government giving back money that they've taken as people have gone into higher brackets. And that's what happens. If you get inflation increase on your pay, you'll gradually slide up into the next bracket. The government gets more tax. And so they hand it back as tax cuts. And what you're going to see in future years, the top marginal tax rate still cuts in at 190,000, up from 180,000. But there'll still be a lot of people creeping up into that bracket, going from 39% to 47%, which then puts more money back in the coffers of the Treasury. So this sort of, as I look at this, I sort of have a bit of a chuckle, because I've had 16 years where that blue line has been below the red, and the blue just went above it slightly there for a couple of years. And Jim Chalmers says, oh, well, I brought in 2 surpluses, but then we go back to deficits, and then magically it's all going to come good by 2034, only 10 years away. Whether it does or not, I'd say highly unlikely. A lot of other treasurers will come and go before then, but they've got to put those in their numbers. They've got to say that they're going to balance the budget over the long term, but it's always hard to do. Same sort of scenario here, where we're saying that we're going to run into deficits again. These are not huge deficits. You see the spike there for the COVID. And I think if Josh Frydenberg was still in Parliament, which he's not, unfortunately he got chucked out at the last election along with the Morrison government, courtesy of the Teals. But I would say that his view would be it was worth it to spend all that money to take on all that extra debt to bring the Australian economy out of what could have been a disaster. So I think it probably was, with the benefit of hindsight, worth it. And so now we're back to more normal sort of economic and budget conditions. But once again, that green line just goes back to line ball by 2034. Now, I really like this, this bit of analysis here, because this is at the granular level. This is the Australian debt. This is the Treasury bonds on issue, which adds up to about 860 billion. I think the gross position is about 900 billion. But look what we're paying on 187 billion of that, between 1 and 1.75%, and actually only 2.37% overall. That's not a lot to pay on debt. Now, the idea that 900 billion is going to go back to zero and back to the days of Costello, where it was zero, is just not going to happen. We're never going to go back to zero debt. But on the flip side of the ledger, so gross debt 900 billion, net debt 500 billion. What's the 400 billion delta? Well, a big chunk of it is the Future Fund, which is now 272 billion. And I checked on the performance of the Future Fund, 8.8% compound for the last 10 years. So the Future Funds, and tax is not an issue here because the government doesn't pay tax, it collects tax. The delta between what we're paying and what we're collecting in the Future Fund is about more than 5%. So that's why they keep the Future Fund, and that's why they're happy to run some debt, because the Future Fund on a net basis is going up. As long as the debt doesn't go up too much either, it's not a problem. That debt figure, net debt figure, is about 30% of GDP, nowhere near the danger zone. It's not really an issue. Some people make a big thing about it, but I'm not fearing for my kids and grandkids about paying back that debt. It's a matter of funding the interest payments and not letting it get out of control. So in terms of the winners, it's just winners lined up galore. You know, there's so many winners. It's probably 90% winners. And it's basically anyone who's going to get a tax cut, deeming rates on pensioners so that you're basically deemed to get a much lower rate than what you're actually getting, which preserves your benefits. You're getting medicines at $7.70 if you're a pension or a concession card holder, and those medicines could be very expensive indeed. You've got students cashing in on a reduction in the indexation, a permanent reduction in how that's going to work, more places for apprentices, which is much needed. Home builders are going to have a field day because there's so many houses that need to be built. The critical minerals people are going to be pleased because of this Made in Australia initiative, and clean energy manufacturers also in that camp. So if we look at the losers, government always saying they're going to use less consultants. In the post-PwC debacle, that's probably going to happen. Universities won't like the cap on the numbers in the foreign students. I'm not sure why backpackers are going to come off second best, probably to do with the tax regime. And the NDIS, which is now running to 60 billion, supposed to be 11 billion when it was first started, but they have managed to rein in the rate of increase, and that's partly by getting rid of some of the dodgy operators. So I think overall, you know, Chalmers said right at the off, he was focused throughout his whole budget. Everything he looked at was around driving inflation down to the extent that he can, knowing that he doesn't have the decision around interest rates being reduced, but that's what he wants to see. I think if he got 1 or 2 rate cuts by the end of the year, he would be very pleased. The structural deficit is going to continue, but when you look at the debt levels and running at 30 or 40 billion worth of deficit, it isn't a big deal as long as you keep the economy going at 2 or 3 or 4% a year of growth, because the pie keeps getting bigger, and as long as the debt doesn't get out of control, it's not such a big deal. I think the Australian's headline bunging on the afterpay was a bit unfair, but that newspaper tends to be a little bit on the right side rather than the left, so I can understand why they might hold that view. Yeah, made in Australia, I guess, could be expanded, but I don't think the 21 to 22 billion is going to make a huge amount of difference. You probably see that coming up as an election issue. We've still got, if you look at the things that they haven't touched, they haven't looked at the GST, they haven't looked at any sort of structural changes in the tax mix. It's in the too hard basket. If they have a bigger majority in the next election, maybe they'll start to look at these things. Jim Chalmers is basically a student of Paul Keating. He wrote his PhD thesis, Brawler Statesman, on Paul Keating, and I've read some of it, and it's very dry, but it shows that he is a disciple of Keating, and we haven't seen a Keating-like budget. We haven't seen any sort of hard decisions, but we may in future years if they get a bigger majority and got more political capital. So no new significant revenue-raising initiatives. There is the superannuation initiative on balances above 3 million, which I'll go into in a minute. But that's in the pipeline, and that's being argued about at the moment. It's not yet law, but that's something that he kicked off last year, so it's not in the mix for this year. Housing is in crisis, so you'll hear a lot about that in the news, but it is one that's very hard to kick into gear to get a lot of houses being built, particularly when the whole construction industry has been decimated during COVID. So just to go through quickly, revised stage 3 tax cuts. So what the Morrison government came up with, Albanese thought was too generous, probably was. But basically under these new rates, anyone under 146,000 is better off than under the old Morrison regime. So as Chalmers said, everyone gets a tax cut, just not as attractive for higher income earners as it was under the Morrison regime. There was a bit of political flack at the time when it was announced, didn't go very far. So I think that was a winner on a net basis. For non-residents, you just miss out on those first two bands. So you go straight to 30% from zero. So if you've got a rental property back in Australia earning net income, you'll pay tax at a minimum rate of 30%. You won't pay the Medicare levy. So those rates that are up there are actually resident rates, and you've got to add 2% for the Medicare levy, which doesn't get you any medical benefits. It's just an additional tax. But as I say, non-residents are up for 30%. Now, you can obviously minimise your tax if you're a non-resident just by buying extra rental properties and gearing up and getting depreciation allowances and things like that. So the stage 3 tax cuts will cost 105 billion, but really it's only giving us back money that we should have had in the first place. I don't think that's going to be a big issue for them. So I created this diagram years ago, and it's interesting that you can go back to it, and all that's changed is the thresholds and a few tweaks. So if you're thinking about putting money into super, if you're in Australia, you're trying to put the 30,000 in deductible each year. And if you're trying to ramp up using an inheritance or the sale of a property or some other, windfall, you can do 120 of what's called a non-concessional contribution. The non-concessional is always 4 times the concessional. That gets indexed from 1 July in both cases. If you're coming back with a big wad of money, you can do 3 years of that 120 in one go, which gives you 360. There's also some carry forward rules of the 30 if you haven't used it in previous years, up to 5 years. So there's various ways there to get extra money into super. And if we look at the changes, the transfer balance gap came in a few years ago, and that basically says that you can put as much money into your super, but once you get to your transfer balance cap, you're not going to be able to keep making contributions unless it's a concessional and under certain circumstances only. So this basically puts a cap. When Costello said it was tax-free with no cap back in 2006-07, it was a very generous regime that basically has been brought back to heel by the transfer balance cap. Looks like the transfer balance cap is going to go up to 2 million next year. So that means you can keep shoveling money in. I guess the change that's being argued about now is really around the 3 million. And you might say, well, how's the 3 million relate to the 1.9? And this is where you can imagine people that have put money in the past when the transfer balance cap didn't exist, or where they've had significant growth over the years, they could well and truly have more than 3 million. So what they're proposing is additional 15% tax on balances of income and capital gains above 3 million, But the kicker here is its unrealised capital gains will be taxed at 15 on top of the normal rates. But you won't get the tax back if you make a capital loss the next year. So there's big objections to that. And so that may or may not see the light of day. So this is pretty much the regime we've got. It's still quite possible that you could get to 1.9 topping up your super and then just sit back and let it grow and have it run to 3 million. And if you're under the point at which you can get money out, you'll be stuck paying that additional what's called Div 296 tax. So there'll still be a lot of people that could be paying that tax. If you're able to access your super, you can take that money out. You can give it another home, like an insurance bond or somewhere else. Minimum drawdown rates, once you do go into the pension phase, you're subjected to these minimum drawdown rates. Most people have got a preservation age somewhere between 55 and 60. So, you know, under certain circumstances, you can get access to your super from 60, but you need to be fully retired or above 65 in order to fully access your super. So once you turn on the pension, you're basically bringing money out at a progressively higher rate. And why did the rates go up? Well, the government wants to see that money go out as people get older. Most people even into their 70s are still able to have their super balance going up, even whilst drawing down the 6%. Eventually, when you get up to 80 years of age, your super balance is going to start to go south. So tax residence, this is the slide we've used before. All of these rules are still the same. Nothing has changed. You can be tax resident under any of those rules, and mostly people would choose to reside in Australia and say, okay, I'm going to be tax resident under that rule, or cease to, if you're a citizen and you cease to have a home overseas, you could be tax resident under the domicile rule, or you could spend more than 183 days and not have a home overseas, get caught under that rule. So, but what has changed is, after all the years that we've been talking about IT 2650, which is the old ruling, which is a terrible ruling because it leaves so much to doubt, the new one, which is TR stands for Tax Ruling 2023/1. So what's interesting about this is we've got 18 examples, and I put in brackets the cases that I think they relate to. So the tax office has really turned its mind to the cases, the case law that's out there, and tried to explain to people why you could be tax resident in Australia if you're in Australia for 12 months, but in other cases not. So what is the delineating factor? Or you could be overseas for a certain period of time and be non-resident, but in other cases, you could still be resident. So for example, a husband that goes overseas and works in a mining company in Brazil, he could be away for 3 years and still stay tax resident, whereas a single person goes off for the same 3 years, doesn't have any connections to Australia, no home to come back to, and he's non-resident. And it's the same sort of person doing the same sort of work in the same country, but one is still tied because he's got family connections and he's got a home that he can go back to and all of those things. And this is where the tax officers caught people out in that situation, the engineering manager, the Dempsey, and various of these cases. But this spells it out. So you've got 18 examples, and it makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on. Now, there's also the double tax agreement, and I was really interested in, the tax office doesn't like double tax agreements. You know, they've got a point there. As you know, we'll abide by the DTA as long as it's not inconsistent with, you know, what we're doing. But I don't know about that. So anyway, that gives us some clarity. The 3 previous rulings, including IT 2650, have been swept away. We've got a brand new ruling, which is basically an amalgam of all of those things. You don't need to read the 40 or so individual tax cases to see where you sit. And I think the average person who's not a tax professional could read this and understand, you know, what's actually going on. But the sting in the tail is still, are we going to see a major change to these rules? And this is the slide that I've shown before, this 45-day rule. So they're talking about a bright line test, 183 days. That's the first leg of it. But this is the second leg, is the real, issue around 45 days plus 2 factors. And the factors could be, I'm a citizen, well, there's factor 1. I've got Australian family, there's factor 2. Or I've got economic interest in Australia, or I've got Australian accommodation, it's going to be really easy for someone who's a citizen to pass these two factors. And if they're in Australia more than 45 days, well, that would put them in the tax net. And then subject to the application of the DTA, which obviously the tax office doesn't really like much. So there's going to be a lot of wrangling around this. I read the Tax Practitioners Board document on this on the 45 days, and I'm not sure that they really understood how it works in other jurisdictions. In other jurisdictions, there's 45 days outbound rules, but they're using it as an inbound rule. So I don't know how this is actually going to go. I talked to the tax partner of Cooper Grace Ward that ran and won the Harding case, which is a big tax case a few years ago. And he'd heard from Treasury that they just didn't have the resources to draft the legislation. They have had lots of consultation with the industry, but I suspect it's still some years off. So when Josh Frydenberg announced it 3 years ago, it was going to come to pass from 1 July of the date after the enabling legislation was passed. Well, we don't even have enabling legislation on the table. So I'd say it's still years into the future. So you don't really need to worry about that. I think if you want to know about your tax residence situation, you're at all concerned, then you would go back to this ruling and have a read of it and see if you can identify yourself with any of those scenarios. So if you're trying, the early stages of setting up non-resident status, and you want to know whether you're actually, met the criteria, then that's what you're going to do. You're going to go and look at it and see whether one of those 18 examples has got your name on it. If it doesn't, and you're concerned, then you should come back to someone like myself, and I can step you through it. Okay, so that's pretty much all I've got. I know maybe that Nathan might want to come back in with a few points, but also if we've got questions as well, there's time for that, I think.
Okay, thanks very much, Geoff. A very comprehensive overview of the budget there. I think many nations, obviously, inflation's a short-term goal, longer-term growth, so no surprises there. Apologies to everybody, lost connectivity for a bit back there. Wouldn't believe it in South Korea, maybe in the UK, but not in Korea, so that's got to be a first. Okay, yeah, so I'll keep this relatively brief. We've lost a bit of time, obviously. So Geoff touched upon superannuations and potential changes coming into force. So sorry, Geoff, could we go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
The previous slide. Okay, yeah. So on the right-hand side, Australian super. No doubt all of you on the call will be familiar with superannuation. It's a given sort of tax efficient, secure investment vehicle to invest in for the future. There could be some potential changes with super. Geoff and I often sort of have conversations about global expats. What really should they be investing in? And certainly, whilst they're outside of Australia, whilst maybe an Australian resident would typically follow the superannuation route for capital growth and retirement, globally you have some more solutions at hand that are available to you. So that's really where myself comes into the mix, whereby Geoff and I can sort of put together comprehensive financial planning. Obviously, Geoff being the more sort of pinpoint tax sort of details there. So typically, something I just very quickly want to touch upon. You may have heard of them, perhaps not. Foreign life policies, offshore portfolio bonds, unit-linked insured vehicles. There's a host of names for other opportunities that you can essentially invest in as a global Aussie expat, typically in conjunction with super. I think the advice would always be to pursue super. I'm sure Geoff would agree with that, but why not diversify and maybe invest in something like an offshore structure? So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Geoff, and I'll allow some time for Q&A. So Australians abroad. So up until about 2010, Australia had quite a harsh regime as to how they treated foreign assets, foreign investments. Bit bit like the US, really. If it's outside of the country, we don't really understand it, so we're going to tax it punitively. We'd rather people did domestic sort of products. So in 2010, we had something called the fifth rules, the repeal of the fifth legislation, which basically made it more favorable for certain, let's say, international or offshore, certainly outside of Australia, structures that people could invest in. And then if we please go on to the next slide, Geoff. Why did this come about? Geoff touched upon immigration in his slideshow. I think over the years, arguably over the last 30, 40 years, like many countries, Australia's wanted to attract global talent. So not just people looking to retire to Australia, but to actually go there and actively work and contribute to the economy. The problem was historically is that for many of us Brits, whoever we were, perhaps moving to Australia, the investments, the kind of financial plans that we had in place were taxed quite harshly in Australia. So the ATO and the Australian government recognised this, and there was a repeal of the fifth legislation. And this essentially made it more favourable, rather than someone like a Brit going over to Australia thinking, oh my God, this is, whilst there's a lot of benefits, I'm going to be ripped apart from my finances that I hold in place. There was some easing as to taxation on foreign-based products. So if we could fly on to the next one, please, Geoff. Okay, so Australians abroad. So typically, I'm not going to get into any detail today and certainly not going to give any advice, but typically there are solutions in place whereby somebody could maybe look at a medium to long-term structure, say 10 years plus, crucially with the Section AH26 of the 2010 ATO legislation. There's an idea of essentially opening up an offshore plan, holding it for 10 years, and then when you get back to Australia, if you do return to Australia to sort of retire or to live out your days, you'll have a tax-free vehicle from which you can extract income. So a bit of a comparison with super. Obviously, it's good to hold both sort of alongside one another. Yes, contributing to super, but also maybe look at the offshore structures. And very quickly, whilst there are restrictions on super, previously 110,000 a year going up to 120 now from July the 1st, backdated 3 years, so potentially 360. With these sort of offshore solutions, there are no restrictions. You can invest what you like. There are no age restrictions. There's currency diversification. So, pretty much like a US or a UK pension, most superannuations are very much good vehicles for Australia, but somewhat rigid in terms of investment choice. They're taxed, for example, on the way in, unlike other worldwide pensions, but they give you a tax-free income in retirement. And I think that the tax rates are 10 and 15% for capital and income. Is that correct, Geoff?
Yeah, so 15% on income and 10% on capital gains.
Yeah, okay. So with the alternate structures, things you might look to sort of take advantage of whilst offshore, there are no sort of, we have something called gross tax-free roll-up. So essentially the money goes in tax-free and it comes out the other end, let's say if you're back in Australia in the future, tax-free as well. So it's a good bit of legislation that we like to make people aware of, that this 2010 ATO passing. So there are some key benefits to that. And just very quickly, I'm just going to, on the next one, please, Geoff, I'll run through the structure. So I'm quite a visual person. I like to see things sort of laid out visually. Not going to go into huge detail here, but why these things qualify for the ATO legislation is because they essentially have an insurance wrapper around the investment platform or the investment structure itself. So typically you'll have a very large international institution, a very secure structure. You'll have the insurance wrapper around it, but you can invest into that. You'll have great investment choice. In some cases, open architecture, where you can invest into almost anything decent and sensible, but also currency diversification. You can put portfolios in line with risk appetite and all the rest of it. So these are the kind of typical things that we advise expats on, and certainly I think the connectivity ran out earlier, but the relationship with Skybound and Geoff, of course, is that we have relationships in place. We're a global financial planning company, have clients all over the world, but we're not tax experts ourselves. So we do utilize the likes of Geoff Taylor, based out of Sydney. So we get the planning correct, certainly investment terms. What are the client objectives? Are those being met? We can take care of that, and we can give a continuity of service and look after clients. But sometimes we bring in experts such as Geoff just to give the pinpoint correct tax advice. So from the client's perspective, it's a win-win all round. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Once again, thank you for your insights on the budget and the changes to taxation. For all you out there, we look forward to catching up in person and on our future webinars. But until then, thank you very much and look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.